All right, well, we're back in the shop today working on my K24 swapped Nissan Cefiro. This is basically something we've built as a streetable, drive it to the trackable drift car. Something that kind of takes us back to our roots, throwing some tires in the back, in the trunk and a jack and some tools, driving to the track, driving all day, having fun, the simpler times. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this car, if you're unfamiliar with the original build we did, or basically up until now of the rebuild we've been doing, this is a 92 Nissan Cefiro, so it's basically a four-door JDM car, but underneath, suspension-wise, it is a Nissan 240SX. It's identical, it's all S13 suspension. So that means we have the most common drift car suspension in the world, but in a unique four-door chassis. That's what really drew me to this car. So we swapped in a Honda K24. Now, obviously, there's a lot of options. The car came with an RB20. I have nothing against them. The most reliable drift car I had 10, 11 years ago was a stock RB20 drift car. So I have a good relationship with RBs, but I really wanted to try out the K-Series in a drift car. I'd heard mixed things about them, and I like to see things for myself, so I wanted to try it, see what the power was like, how it made power, weight balance, how the oil system held up, all of that good stuff. So we swapped in a stock K24 A2 originally with valves and valve springs, so just a little bit of head work. Behind that, we had a ZF 6-speed, basically E46 BMW transmission, and we've got a Borg-Warner EFR 7163 turbo, and it made really good power right off the bat. And my goal for this thing was only around 300, 350, but we kept turning it up, we fixed some issues, and it started making boost at really low RPM, like 3,100 RPM, and pretty much as soon as it started making boost that early and making all that low end torque, we sent a rod out the block.
Video I've ever recorded.
Basically cut the block in half, and that's because if there's one thing K-Series rods don't like, being as how long they are, it's low end torque, high cylinder pressures. So we knew that, and I pretty much immediately had regretted not doing rods and pistons in the bottom end. So that's what we did this time. The car caught on fire when it blew up, so we fixed some of the fire damage. We found another engine, did a basic rebuild, just an at-home home job kind of deal. Did a rods, pistons, bottom end, so now we've got basically a built bottom end as well as a built head. So now we should be able to really wring this thing's neck and not have to worry about spitting a rod out the block, because again, that is the one weak link of the K24. So along with that, we decided to make some other changes while we were there. You know how that goes. We got rid of the ZF 6-speed and swapped in a T56 Magnum transmission with a QuickTime bell housing. So there's a few reasons for this, but mainly the T56s are really, really stout, and they have a double overdrive. This being a street car, being a 4-cylinder, the gearing we have, I wanted to be able to put it in overdrive and cruise on the highway at 75, 80. That among some other reasons, but that's something I'm really excited about because I haven't found anyone who's done it. We had to get a custom pilot bearing made. It's been a bit of a challenge, but we're on the home stretch there. So yeah, moral of the story is the goal is to finish out this revision, this rebuild of this car and get it running. It should only take us a week, 2 weeks tops to get this thing back on the road. There's not much left to do. We got really close, but then we had to drop everything and move back onto building the C6 competition drift car build because that took precedent because we had a deadline on that car and we have been working on that car nonstop. We finally got a break. It's not even in the shop because it's now getting wrapped. So we can finally dive into this thing and get some work done. So anyway, that being said, we got a bit to do. We're just gonna dive headfirst into it and just start knocking out things as fast as we can. So let's get to it. So the first project that we needed to tackle was pulling the transmission back out. We had put it in there to test fit it and make sure it fits, but we were waiting on our throwout bearing setup. It was back ordered by about 3 months and is what really delayed us finishing this whole project. So this is really step one. Get the transmission back out, get the throwout bearing installed so we can reinstall the transmission for the final time. All right, so we have an adjustable throwout bearing, which we need for this combination. We've got a K-Series twin disc, which is really thin, and then a T56 adapter bell housing and a T56. We got a Frankenstein kind of combo here. So we need to know the distance from basically the face of the transmission here to the pressure plate fingers here, so we can set our throwout bearing accordingly. So our straight edge here is 25 mils, so we're just gonna subtract that from whatever this number is. Yeah, 128. So 128 minus 25 gives us 103. And then we need about a 3 millimeter air gap. If we make it too tight, it's gonna be kind of pushing on the clutch all the time, and the clutch is never gonna be fully engaged. But if we make it too far, then you're gonna have to push the clutch pedal so far to get it to disengage. So yeah, we got a measurement. So this setup that we're using is pretty out of the box. There's not really much information on using a T56 behind a K-Series, and we had to get creative and do our own research. So here we have an adjustable tilt and throwout bearing, but we needed a really small diameter face because it's a small diameter clutch. But even that, with all of the adjustment range that it had, didn't seem like it was going to be enough based off our initial measuring. So we have a 1-inch spacer, then the adjustable throwout bearing setup. And with all of that combination on, we've got it measured out, and it looks like it's going to work perfect. We've got it dialed into our 3 mil air gap. Luckily, this combination of parts, it panned out as we hoped. So with everything adjusted, Loctited, and tightened down, we are ready to start reinstalling this setup back into the car, which, as you might expect, is a little bit challenging considering we're putting a T56 in what's effectively really an S chassis. It's a really tight fit, but there's just enough room everywhere. Now, once we get it all lined up, it goes together really easy, but getting it up into place, it's got a bunch of bulky parts to it that kind of want to smash into everything. So it's a little tricky to get it lined up, but once you get it lined up, it slides right in. We just have to bolt it in and then throw our transmission mount back on. Now, this transmission mount is not my proudest work at all. Can I just say that now? It's one of those things, we originally test fitted this trans, and I built this trans mount while we were working in the garage on the quick jack, so laying on my back. It's just a lot more difficult to fabricate something when you gotta roll in and out from under the car as opposed to just walk up to it under the lift. So if it doesn't work, you know, we'll change it, but we got the trans in. Now it's time to drop the car down and get to work on the rest of it. All right, the next thing I gotta do is fix a little issue we've got with my intercooler here. So I built this V-mount intercooler radiator setup when I built the car originally. I always wanted to try one. I wanted to keep everything tucked back here. Not necessary because it's a street car, but I wanted this simple packaging because we were moving to such a short engine. It's just one of those things I wanted to do. Didn't need to be done, didn't have to be done. I just wanted to do it. I wanted to try making a setup like this, but we made some changes on this version. Since we switched to the Toge factory intake manifold, it moved our throttle body location, which meant our piping didn't work. So we redid it with this fixed pipe. It was kind of tricky, but we made it work. Oh, there we go. So you can see we've got our Mishimoto bar and plate oil cooler, our Mishimoto race radiator mounted into the chassis. But where I mount my oil filter housing here, I just welded this bar on and drilled and tapped it, but I didn't have quite the right drill bit size, so the threads are just a little bit big. So the bolts are one of those things that you can only just snug them up. So we're gonna try to helicoil this and see if we can get some better thread engagement and be able to actually really tighten down our oil filter housing, make it a little more secure. No turning back now. Helicoiling this mount has been on my agenda for a while, and it's one of those things where I knew if I didn't get it done now, it would never get done because I wouldn't want to pull the intercooler back out. This is one of the reasons why I took so much time when I built the C6, because I didn't want to have all of these things. This is one of those things that's bugged me for a while, and I've been wanting to fix it for a while, and it's hard to tear your car apart to fix something that's not absolutely necessary. So to put the intercooler back in, we need to get our ducting back in. So I have these little plates that I made. We replaced the rubber seals on them. They were getting a little bit worn out from taking them in and out, and they're pretty pertinent. Not only are they going to help seal the air going through the radiator, but they're also going to keep them from digging into the radiator and cracking it or making a hole or a leak that we've got to deal with later. So another thing that needed to be upgraded on the upgrade list for when we rebuilt this car was the alternator. The stock alternator, being that this is a small little 4-cylinder, is only like a 90 amp, 100 amp unit. So we've got a 160 amp alternator to go in. We were definitely low on charge current, and I think it's a big thing that was affecting our power steering. Since we have an electric power steering pump, we need a lot of amperage to keep that thing happy and keep it working in its optimal window. And with that stock alternator, there just wasn't enough power there to make that work like we wanted it to. The steering never felt great, and that was one of my biggest gripes with this car driving it, was the steering feel. So we're hoping this will fix that. We've got a few other ideas as well that we're hoping will solve that too, but we'll get into those later. For now, we need to get this thing up and running. So next up on the agenda was to put some fresh plugs in. One of them got smashed when the engine blew up, and plus it's not a bad idea, fresh engine, fresh plugs. So we de-gapped them. They came out of the box with a high 20 gap, and we want to reduce that down to about 18. So this plug de-gapping tool, definitely way nicer way to do it than banging it on the table and hoping you can get it to bend just enough but not too much. So especially with these iridiums, because you can't really open it back up. So once we got them all gapped where we wanted them, we can put the coil packs back in, and as I'm doing that, Josue's working on fixing and redoing some lines. So one of our lines wasn't long enough anymore, and one of our fuel lines was a bit crusty from the fire, just finding more damage as we go to put this thing back together. There's just things you miss when you take it apart and see what's good and what's not good. So he's working on getting those lines remade. I'm working on getting our ground cables done and hooked up. We are just plugging away at this thing, trying to knock out anything. It's one of those projects where you can just kind of see something and start doing it. You don't have to go in any steps, any order. The only thing we really needed to wait on was putting the intercooler back in, which I was kind of antsy to do because I wanted to see if my helicoil job worked out as well as I was hoping it did. But it's a lot easier to get to everything down underneath, like the coolant hoses and some of the wiring and things like that, with the intercooler up and out of the way. So once we got that back in, we're pretty much on to some of the last steps. And one of the things we need to do is relume this part of the harness, because we changed where we put the oil pressure sensor. So we're using this Holley fire resistant loom. This stuff saved our harness the first time, so we're definitely using it again. All right, well, we've just been plugging away at this thing, and it is a lot more complete than when we started. We've been getting all the little odds and ends done, radiator hoses. We remade this fuel line, getting some of that stuff figured out. We've got the intercooler mounted in here. The helicoil job worked out great. This thing is super sturdy now. We relocated the oil pressure sensor over here because originally it was teed in over here with the oil feed, and one of those lines got burnt up anyway, but it was just a mess. I wasn't a fan of it. I wanted to move it over here, but laziness got the better of me. I didn't feel like splitting the harness apart and relooming it, but we got the job done this time. So that's all done. Man, just plugging away at this, doing these odds and ends. We're real close. Our goal is to fire this thing up tonight. We don't have much left to do to at least fire it off. We need to fill the engine with oil, and we need to fill the trans with transmission fluid. We've got to get the wiring harness draped back over, plugged back in everywhere. Really the biggest challenge that we have ahead of us to start it is our wiring situation over here, because when the car blew up, I stole the battery out of it to put in my Pulsar, and then I bought another battery for it, but then I stole that to put it in my Vet because it's the same battery I had in my Vet, and I wanted to run two of them so we had better life and more starting power and yada yada. So I don't have a battery for this car that's gonna fit here, and this is where all the wiring is. So we're gonna have to come up with something there, but I'm sure if that's all we've gotta do, we can make something happen. So that being said, the only way we're gonna get this started tonight is if we get back to hustling and just keep plugging away at all the odds and ends. So I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering. We're gonna get back to it. So once I came to the realization that we could actually fire this thing up tonight, I realized I didn't have the right oil to do this. Since I rebuilt this motor and it's got new bearings and new rings and a at-home job, we need some brake-in oil. But since I don't have any, we're going to use the oil I normally run for this car just to fire it up. It's not something I normally do. I normally don't like to rush things. I would just wait for the break-in oil, but I really want to see if this thing runs. It's been basically put on a shelf for a while. We haven't touched it. We haven't looked at it. We haven't worked on it. And we're so close. So we got to do what we got to do sometimes. So now with the oil filter on, we need to just go ahead and start getting the wiring hooked back up. Now, fortunately, while the K-Series is a somewhat complex motor in the sense that it has VTEC and VTC and these things, it's actually a really simple harness. There's not a lot to it. And a lot of that's just because it's a simple 4-cylinder, but the harness goes in pretty easy. Luckily, I built the harness myself, so I remembered exactly kind of how everything went. and where everything goes. So it wasn't too bad to slam the harness back in, get it hooked back up, and luckily we didn't have anything else to fix on it. I wasn't sure, since it had been so long since we worked on it the last time, whether or not we had any more fire damage to fix, if we had fixed it all. If we hadn't, I wasn't even sure if it was going to work again and everything was going to plug back in, because that fire was pretty gnarly. This thing caught on fire pretty dang good, but luckily it's all lubed back up. Any of the parts that got damaged have been fixed. It's all back routed in place, looks nice as it should. So now it's time to lift the car up and start working on the stuff underneath. We need to make sure all of our pan plugs are tight and thread taped and all of that is done, and then we need to fill the trans with fluid. So unfortunately, we don't have any clutch hydraulics right now, so we can't press the clutch in and keep the transmission from spinning. So we need to make sure that it's full of fluid, because as the engine's running, it's going to be spinning. So we don't want it spinning dry and without any fluid in it. That would not be the ideal scenario. So with all of that done, all we need to do is top it off with oil and figure out a solution for our wiring mess. So luckily we came across some battery cables. We came up with an idea that we think's gonna work and not be too janky. Now you can do this with like jumper cables, but I've done that and it's just not the best way to do it. They fall, they unclip, you start shorting out. It's not the ideal scenario. I wanted to make it at least semi-legit. All right, well, I think we're about ready to start trying to start it. We've got everything hooked up as far as we know. I don't think we forgot anything. We've got the injectors unplugged at the moment because we're gonna try to crank it over and get oil through the system, because it's gotta go through the lines, into the filter housing, out through the cooler, and back into the engine. So we've got a bit to fill up. We gotta get it into the turbo, so we're gonna wanna crank it for a minute before we try to fire it. That's if we can get it cranking, you know, that's step one. So as I said, we're ready to start to try to start it. So we got a little bit of a janky situation, but we've got these battery cables out of the vet chassis that I saved just in case one day I needed them for something, and they're gonna work mint for hooking up to a battery outside of the car so we can try to power this thing up. So let's do it, I guess. It's now or never, right, Josue?
I'm ready.
You ready?
I think so.
This thing went back together pretty quick. Still nerve-wracking. I think something that helps is that I built the motor like a while ago now, so I'm not as nervous about the motor as I would be if I had just built it, you know? See if we get any sparks. What was that? Oh, the rear wiper.
We got power.
We got power. We gotta find the switch in here to turn the rear wiper
I
on.
was gonna try, but it's like you should try, because
If only we had a normal battery, we'd be like ready to start it. It always feels cheap. Like, I don't like doing stuff this way, you know. I know a lot of people when they're rushing try to do it like this, but to me this feels silly, because it's like, what's the point, really, at the, what's the point of me starting it right now? There really isn't any, other than wanting to, right? So for me, it always feels silly, because it's like, if I don't have a battery in it, if I can't drive it, why am I starting it? But also, on the same token, if we start it and we find some major issue, it'd be good to know now before we continue putting everything together. So, let's see both sides of it.
the ground back on.
Oh yeah, sure. But we do have gauges now. The ECU is connected. Is there pressure? Oh yeah, 33. All right, I'm gonna crank. Oh. Okay. All right, take two. Starter wasn't plugged in all the way. Oh, that battery is dead. That was, I'll keep it off. We'll put it in a water bottle. I should have pulled the plugs out of it so it could spin over more easily and prime. Going?
Yep.
All right, put it back on. What?
I'm worried.
Same. How do you think I feel?
Like, all right, there we go.
All right, Injectors are plugged in. Coil packs back in, plugged back in. It's time. Seems like all systems go. If it starts, we'll find out if they are or not. Oh, it's so scary. There's so many things that could be. Like it's nothing. I don't know what the oil pressure was because it was saying 100. But it read 0 before. Because it read 0, like it read 0 with the key on. Woo! Look at that! Second try. First try, really. Wow, that's impressive, dude. Fire right up. Yeah, now it says 0. I mean, it reads 0 when it's all. I'll have to check the scaling of it.
But yeah, it starts up.
Dude, it starts up like nothing.
Open down by baby.
It sounds rowdy like that, doesn't it? Dude, that's so sick. If I hadn't been such a slacker on the dang drive shaft, we'd be ready to party. I mean, I still gotta do the rest of the exhaust, but.
Things to tie up, but this thing is great.
Look at that, boys. Fired right up. It did the first little chugga and then fired right up. Idled. The only issue that we see so far is the oil pressure is reading 100. I don't know if it's actually making 100 pounds of oil pressure. That's kind of confusing. I'm not really sure what that is. Because with just the key on, ignition on, it reads 0. Like it should, and then when you start it, it reads 100. I did do the ported oil pump, so I don't know if that's part of it. But yeah, anyway, whew, we gotta open the doors. Dude, that's so sick. Rebuilt motor, fires right up. All right, well, everything looks good underneath. We don't have any leaks. We just spit the plug out of the back of the trans. So we're waiting on a drive shaft, waiting on a few lines and fittings for our clutch lines to get these connected. Basically, both of those things need to happen at the same time. We got to redo the middle section of the exhaust, tidy up a few odds and ends, but man, wow, that happened real quick. It's definitely crazy how close this thing was when we had to park it and wait for that part and move on to the vet. Like we were so close, you know, I am elated that this thing fired right up. You know, I put that motor together myself. I built it months ago, and you know, we worked on the car. We redid a lot of the fab work, got things mostly together, and I kind of had forgot how far out we really were. And to just fire it up and it fired right up as soon as we tried. That's a feeling, man. That's a feeling. So I'm stoked. We don't have much left on this thing, you know, maybe like a week's worth of work. Max, really, it's just gonna be waiting on the drive shaft because I drug my feet on ordering it. Once we get that in, we're gonna work on the exhaust and getting the clutch hydraulics done, fill it with coolant, get the intercooler fans on, put the front end back together, swap the wheels. I mean, really not much. We should be driving this thing again, which would be sick. So excited to drive it with the built motor. So anyway, I'm jibber jabbering. I'm just stoked. I'm stoked. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and end it here. We'll probably dive back into this thing tomorrow. We'll have to see how we're feeling. We're kind of bouncing around between projects, so we'll see how things go. But for now, that's going to be a wrap. So thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Goodbye.